the EU Blue Card is a amazing tool. You can get a permanent residence in 21 months, which is insane.
So what's the Berlin vibe?
Berlin's official tagline is poor but sexy. I can officially say that Wolt has probably priced me out of the market. Like, I'd have to go to say Facebook or Google to make the same kind of money that I do. Can we take on Amazon? They're not like super big. So like,
Why isn't Amazon big?
one of the biggest challenges in Europe, people are very used to being inconvenient. In every country, how many daily orders are we doing? You have to divide by seven. Only in Germany, you divide by six because you don't have the seventh day working, which is insane. I think moving with a family, senior level, that's the best kind of person who should move here.
I've heard is that if you're an immigrant and you're in Germany, moment you become a senior director and you're trying to become a VP, SVP, a CXO suite, it starts getting a little harder.
There may be some truth to that.
I'm so excited to have you, Gokul, on the latest episode of the Svagat show. Thank you so much. Gokul and I go back many, many years. I went to the same university in India. Gokul was a founder, and that's when we got connected when he was running an interesting consumer company. Since then, he spent a lot of time around marketplaces, mobility at Gojek, and now most recently at Wolt, where he's the head of product. Thank you so much, Gokul, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Chief. It's been a long, long, long time indeed. Feels like yesterday, but I think we've known each other for about close to 10 years now, over 10 years, to be honest.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
thanks so much for having me and look forward to a good chat.
Love to learn, like, how did you end up deciding moving to Berlin from India? Like, what was the thought process?
Yeah, so it was May 2021. We had our kid in Feb 2021, and my wife and I were talking about moving outside India to get some globalized perspective. And I realized, hey, maybe I want my kid to grow up as an international citizen. And then we were looking at a bunch of countries, and I primarily weighed the following parameters, right? One, what is the ease of migration to this place? Two, what is the breadth of opportunities that existed there? Three was what was the quality of life improvement vis-a-vis Bangalore, where we were living a pretty comfortable, luxurious life, and how far it was from India. What was the path to a citizenship like? Because the ultimate goal for me of living outside was how do I get to a second passport or an alternate passport really fast? When I considered all of these sort of different parameters, obviously India came out first. Still, my decision tree told me that, hey, you have to stay back in India. But then I decided for personal reasons that I'm going to go outside India. And when I generated a stack rank, like any good PM does, Germany came out on top because the EU Blue Card is an amazing tool. And Germany, for example, is making it easier to get a blue card. And not many people know about this blue card system. And two, it gives you a fast track to permanent residency. There's a path to citizenship. And I believe Berlin specifically is going to be, EU's answer to a post-Brexit London. This was my thesis back then. And with a congregation of tech talent across various companies, Central European sort of accessibility, good weather, English speaking, cosmopolitan vibes, and all of this kind of stuff. And also lower cost of living. These things made me choose Berlin, not to mention the fact that it's like an overnight flight from Chennai, where my folks live. So yeah, that's how we zeroed in on Berlin.
Interesting. How much of research did you do into Berlin's tech ecosystem before deciding to pull the trigger?
Yeah, I think I looked at Europe as a broader canvas and said, like, which are the most interesting companies to work in Europe that sort of matched my expectations of scale and also like where I could play a good role in. So I'd built 0 to 1 products, as you had mentioned. I'd worked at scale at Gojek. So I was looking for something in between, which was like a growth stage startup that was on the cusp of like really explosive growth. And there were a few companies, Get Your Guide, Omeo, Adyen, Booking.com, of course, for the more mature side. And then, of course, there were the typical European companies that I was looking at, Zalando, Delivery Hero, all of these kinds of companies. But then Volt was, sort of a bit of a red herring in the sense that nobody had has heard of it. Pretty much like in our typical Indian tech ecosystem, but then it turned out to be massively big, and at the time, I think it was the number one or number two of the top 50 startups in Europe. That's how I zeroed in on Volt. But then I took a broader view, saying like I'm going to look at Europe's entire tech ecosystem and then take a call, not just focus on Berlin.
Years,
3 years in about 20 days.
And what have you learned about the German Berlin European tech ecosystem? What do you see around you?
I think we're having this conversation at a very interesting time, day after the Draghi report came in, and when Apple Intelligence is not launching in the EU, and all of this kind of like interesting conversations about tech, European accelerationism, and stuff like that. I genuinely think that Europe, Germany, and Berlin in particular are having their eyes open on sort of making Berlin and your Germany a tech hub of sorts. And today there are some interesting companies, a bunch of interesting startups. You have, again, like I said, you have Get Your Guide, which is probably one of the most used travel apps in the world. You have Omio, you have Zalando, you have what is it, Delivery Hero, you have banks like N26, and then of course companies like Wolt, which are dominating the Berlin ecosystem, so to speak. But then you also have a lot of companies, including Fang, hiring in Germany as a whole. I often see Google job postings and like Microsoft job postings. And I don't think many people know this, but Twitter has an office in Berlin. And there are a lot of these smaller tech ecosystems that keep popping up. SoundCloud was a major startup story from Berlin before it unfortunately shut down.
Yeah, I think even
So I think
Typeform, right? Typeform is
Typeform is Berlin. Wunderlist, which got acquired by Microsoft, and then now the founders are building the Superlist app. That's based in Berlin. So I think there's a lot of these like it's a dark horse, so to speak, of the European startup ecosystem.
so. What's the Berlin vibe? Uh, like what would you say is the ethos of Berlin?
Berlin's official tagline is poor but sexy. So I think like that describes the city really, really well. You won't get like a Parisian or a London affluence in Berlin, which is a little bit of a downside. But the upside is that it's way cheaper to live in Berlin, and tech salaries are really good. So, on a purchasing power level, you're way better off in Berlin on a tech salary than say in London.
In what way? Like what are the costs like?
So I think I'll just like give you the typical Chinese fried rice takeout example. I was in London a few months back, and we ordered like some normal fried rice from some hole in the wall restaurant. That cost us like on Uber Eats, it was like 35 pounds. The same thing, which is like 40 euros, give or take. The same thing in Berlin would not have cost me more than 15 euros or 20 euros. Twice as expensive. That's how I see London. Of course, salaries in Berlin are lower than say London or typical SF pay, but there are companies like Wolt itself, for example, which pay really, really well, even relative to market standards, especially in product engineering, data, these kinds of like talent scarce functions, and that sort of puts you in the top 2%, 3% of the entire Germany, which in itself is a pretty rich country to start with, at least for now.
Yeah, and how do the startup salaries compare to say the big tech FANG salaries in Berlin?
I think they pay pretty well. So if you consider big tech, what's big tech in Berlin is Zalando, Delivery Hero, and all of these guys. And what I consider startup is like Wolt and
I mean, I would have considered big tech like Facebook and Microsoft, GitHub, and
yeah, I think at least I can give a perspective of Volt. I think they pay at par or close to. And I think the better the talent, and especially like Volt as a company, pays top dollar for top talent. That's the policy. So, I can officially say that Volt has probably priced me out of the market, like in the sense like I'd have to go to say Facebook or Google to make the same kind of money that I do.
got it. And the breakdown, like how when we started out in India, right? 2010s, equity was considered as something which is like it's very common, even in large companies where equity would be maybe 10-15% of your compensation, very different from the rest of the world, like in the US or even I would say London. it's very common where your base compensation might be maybe 50 to 60% of your overall stuff, and then the equity sort of covers a lot of that, right? Is that something that you notice in Germany as well? What's the outlook towards equity versus cash compensation?
Yeah, I think it really depends on companies, but I think Germany and like the continental Europe typically has an averse reaction to ESOPs and RSUs, mainly because of the way the taxation is triggered. And I think like with the Draghi report and all of that, I think they will hopefully look to revisit some of the stuff. But that said, at least from my perspective, personal experience has been that equity is a very significant portion of my comp, and like I'd say like 60% of my comp is equity, only 40% is base. And that's due to a bunch of reasons, and not the least that I joined Volt just before the DoorDash acquisition. So there was like a lot of retention grants and stuff like that that I got. And also this, for me, equity is very interesting personally because what I ultimately ended up getting was US company stock. Um, Listed on Nasdaq. So that's a bit of a different flavor. But local company compensation, yeah, I think we're between your base making 50 to 70% of total comp is something that I've seen normally. Of
Got
course,
it.
this varies across companies, but I think this is fair to say.
Got it. So let's change tracks a little bit. I've always thought of, I mean, I think for most of us who are not from Berlin, when one thinks of Berlin, one immediately thinks of Rocket Internet, right? Like that's sort of the company that put Berlin on the map, e-commerce, huge scale, global. Does that pretty much reflect the entire Berlin ecosystem? I know you mentioned a bunch of companies, but like would you say like Berlin is all about e-commerce and e-commerce enablers and stuff like that? Or is there a B2B side? I remember, I think one of the large companies in B2B that came out of Berlin, I think Contentful was based in Berlin as well, right?
Conderful was based
But
in Berlin. Highgraph is based in Berlin. Clarisites, which incidentally has an Indian founder, is based in Berlin. There are a bunch of these B2B players. I wouldn't say I'm like super well versed with B2B, given that B2C is more my vibe, but I do know that you have companies. Actually, you could say that there are B2B companies and logistics enablement, B2C enablement that are in Berlin. Like I know a bunch of companies that support last mile logistics, and they support these kinds of companies that are based in Berlin, quite a few.
correct. And when you think of these companies, I don't know where does going global fit into all of this. So obviously, like you have examples like SAP, and historically, which companies have become big. Contentful obviously is a global player, but one of the things that I often think about is in terms of the ambitions of the founders. Obviously, in places like India, the domestic market is so large that you're often just trying to figure out local consumption, and that's good enough to take you to the next stage. As you've immersed yourself in the European ecosystem, what's your views on companies going global? Do you see that as a DNA?
I think it really depends on the space. Like markets like Zalando are very happy to just play in Europe, which is a single market, but is a bunch of countries, ultimately different purchasing power, different demographics. Then you have companies like Flink, which have tried to go global. And the best global company example that I can actually think of is Wolt itself, because it started like people are very surprised when I tell that Volt was started in Helsinki. Even though we have a really large tech hub in Berlin, it's a Finnish startup, and people are all the more surprised when I tell them that Volt exists in like 28 different countries across the world. Israel is a very big market for us. Japan is a big emerging market for us. So, like, there are companies like this that think global, but then you have companies like N26, which are very happy to play within the European finance system, which in itself is a big market to play in. So I think it really depends on the industry and the company and the founder ambitions.
Anything that's unique about the Volt founders that made them think global and think at such a large scale that you've noticed?
Yeah, I think Mickey and all the founders like they don't really think small, and they think like massively big. And I think Mickey often tells that like this is like we are no longer in the food delivery business. We are in the retail business. So we are like, and when you think about say Amazon as a player in Europe, they're not like super big. So like, can we take on players like that potentially? Like that's the level of ambition that Mickey and folks carry, and I think that just seeps through the entire company.
Why is that? Why isn't Amazon big?
I think
Because when I look at London, Amazon is pretty big in London, right? Like especially like delivery, Amazon Fresh, like people order groceries all the time. Like, what's the reason it's not penetrated Germany?
it's very interesting. Like, I think I'm only taking a guess here. I've thought about this, but I don't have anything more than a guess. One is
Because
that,
infra can't be a problem. Germany has one of the best infrastructure in the world, right? Like, so
yes,
just wondering like what's the reason?
density is a problem. So the norther you go up, your population becomes more and more scarce, which is ironically one of the reasons why Volt succeeded. Volt specifically went after towns and cities that no one else would enter, and they built a massive bunch of spokes. And you actually don't have, Amazon doesn't have a base in the Nordics. When you order Amazon in Finland, it actually gets shipped from Germany. So like the fact that they have not established warehouses and like massive centers outside of say Berlin, Luxembourg, these kinds of places are big for Amazon, but beyond that they don't have a much of a presence in Europe. I think it also partly has to do with how much people are willing to pay for convenience. That's one of the biggest challenges in Europe. People are very used to being inconvenient. Like people don't really value convenience. This is changing as demographics end up changing. But the vast majority of people, they are very comfortable like not getting like next day shipping or same day shipping, or they're very happy to like walk down to the nearest bookshop or whatever. And that I think plays a key role in why Amazon and the likes don't aren't big. Interestingly though, eBay is very big because Germany specifically has a massive secondhand market and people keep buying used products. So eBay's, I think Kleinanzeigen, like that's the name if I'm pronouncing it correctly. So that kind of secondhand used goods marketplaces are pretty big.
I'd imagine Vinted might have a lot of traction as well. Yeah.
Yes, something like that. Exactly.
So how does one then think about the German consumer? So I'm very curious to learn the nuances that you've noticed because you've obviously now seen the Indian consumer, you've seen the Southeast Asian consumer, and so where does the European or specifically German consumer fit into all of this? How do they think? How does one design services that gets adoption? Because just going on the point where you said that they're used to inconvenience. So what does that mean?
I think you don't really have to look beyond what five-star hotels look like in continental Europe vis-a-vis, say, what they look like in, for example, Middle East or India to really know the difference. Number one, I think German consumers, I would say, are very used to waiting. The typical appointment takes like 2 weeks, 3 weeks to materialize. Like I have to book appointments for my dog's groomer 6 months in advance. Like that's the level of craziness that people are used to here. So you design services, people are very used to supply constrained services. I was ordering cake for my wife's birthday last year, and I came across which was apparently a good baker in Berlin, and something on the website read something like, please make sure to place your order several months in advance of your event. So for my next birthday, I need to plan for this birthday. And that's how Germans are. Like they for 2024 vacation, they have already made the bookings in 2023. And so they're very forward thinking, forward planning oriented. They don't actually trust digital systems all that much. I was very surprised to know that cash is such a massive payment method in Germany. I read something on the lines of 40% of the entire German economy is cash, which is like massive considering how big the German economy is. I don't know again if this holds true in a post-COVID world or not, but this is something that I read. And this is the one place. 2 weeks after we moved here, I saw a request for me to fax something. Like I've never used a fax machine in my life. I did that in 2021 in Germany. So like I think that's what the German consumer is like. Very used to waiting, very knows that things are supply constrained. And they also, respect other people's time and they expect their time to be respected. All of these kinds of like very cultural, very German nuances. And they don't like rules being broken. And this is true for the government as well as for consumers. Like if your delivery guy is like jumping a red signal, that's in London. I don't know how you guys cross roads. Like you cross roads with when the signal is red all the time. But in Germany, like that's a faux pas that you really don't want to do.
So that doesn't mean that, I mean, the way I'm interpreting this is that when you think of Germany, right, historically, you think of large factories, you think of people working. And now when you're saying that people don't mind, taking time, does it mean that Germany has a very workaholic culture?
No, not at all. Not at all. One of the reasons why the
Because in a 2 by 2 matrix, if I were to look at it, it's like, hey, if you're lazy, convenience services would do well. If you're okay waiting, that means that you might not. But at the same time, German is also very highly focused on productivity, and so I'm just trying to make sense of these. It feels like a dichotomy in some ways, right? Like,
it is. You're right in the sense that Germans, I think Germany as a country tends to focus a lot on I'm gonna do work within these stipulated hours, and outside of it, I don't care. And I think there was even a Wall Street Journal article around this, which said Germans really care about their Feierabend, which means like free evenings, which is why your typical shop closes at 7 p.m. instead of 9 p.m. People really
and
care
it's
about
completely closed on weekends, as I found out during Oktoberfest.
Sunday.
Damn.
Sunday is like, so the funniest story is this actually caused problems when we were launching Volt Market. I heard from an internal story. In every country, to compute like how many daily orders are we doing, you have to divide by seven. Only in Germany, you divide by six because you don't have like the seventh day working, which is insane. But then that's an example. Like people have like we have made our lives around like making sure that everything is stocked by Saturday.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So obviously this is very different from, the culture that we have in India or even in the Valley, right? Like I'm just thinking of Mark Zuckerberg's break fast, move fast and break things. Like just imagining how that would freak out somebody in Germany where you're like, we'll figure out regulation and all of those things, but let's at least get to a scale where we have to worry about that. And so if there is someone, obviously there's been a huge rise in the number of people from India in Germany over the years. I see so many Indians in places like Zalando, and so just wondering, Zalando Delivery Hero. So I'm just wondering, like, if somebody is thinking of making the move to Germany, how should they go about it?
Yeah, I think this is a good move in my view for a specific cohort of people. First of all, like if you're moving to continental Europe, you're moving not because career is your top priority, but you're trying to strike a balance between career growth and personal time, like time you can focus, unfettered time for your family and that kind of stuff. So this is the reason you're moving to Europe. If you're moving to Europe for career growth only, I think that's a very bad decision to make. There are many other places in the world that offer that. This is true particularly for places like Germany, right? Um, it's no secret that the standard deductions on your income are, are significant. Out of pocket, I pay like 37% net income tax. And for me, the benefits are because I have a family. If you're a single person, I would actually not recommend that you move to Europe unless the reason for you moving to Berlin is because of the crazy party scene and like you want to, date internationally, find someone from another country to get married and settle down and that kind of stuff. But purely from an economic perspective, it makes sense to move when you have a family and when you have kids and stuff like that. This is true particularly for Berlin and Germany. And I
Yeah, you
also
mentioned
think that,
you mentioned 37%. That seems similar
yeah,
to India. That seems similar to the US. That seems similar to, in fact, seems lower than the UK. So, like, I mean, do you feel that's high?
I don't feel it's very high at all. It's actually one of the things that I keep tweeting about. Like,
I mean,
we often perceive
where else will it
Europeans,
be? Where
specifically,
is it lower than this, other than Singapore and Middle East? I actually thought it would be
I
something
think
like
Singapore
15 or
and
20.
Dubai, it's lower than 37. It's true. It's close to 50% in places like Helsinki and the Nordics. But Germany, if you're a married person and both of you are working, you file a joint tax. I think the effective taxation comes to somewhere around 37 to 38%.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Yeah, you were saying the other
Yeah. So I
rule.
think like someone who is senior, someone who is built a lot of experience under their belt, and that kind of persona, someone of the family, someone who's senior, built a lot of street cred, so to speak, that companies are willing to pay top dollar to move them from India, and especially growth stage startup like say N20 or Wolt are ready to hire them. I think moving with a family, senior level, I think that's the best kind of person who should move here. And when you're moving to Berlin, for example, I think you have a lot of you should not be put off by the tax number. It's actually it can feel pretty high, especially taxation on stocks, like I mentioned, is pretty high. So it can feel off-putting sometimes, but I think you should just weigh that in relation to the benefits that you end up ultimately receiving from the government, like free healthcare. My kid gets free daycare that I know everybody in London would kill for. Very subsidized, super cheap, super effective public transportation, amazing parks and like open spaces and that kind of stuff. This is the stuff that I feel is quality of life. And I think you get a lot of that for the tax dollar that you end up paying.
Got it. Culturally, anything like is the Indian experience valued in Germany? Like, say you worked in companies in India, might be like obviously well-known companies and things like that. Like, so I'm just trying to understand like what are some of the things to keep in mind as people who made this decision are thinking of making the move, applying to companies and things like that.
I think definitely brand name matters a lot. Like if you've worked for for me, it was very easy for me to sell to Wolt because I had worked at Gojek, similar space, bigger scale, same kind of problems and all of that kind of stuff. I do think that you should have proof of work, but ultimately some companies end up having a very hierarchical org structure. I know, for example, in product management, people with 7 years of experience apply to certain companies here and they can only get like senior product manager at best. And like that's just very cultural to the company, but there are many companies like that. And one strong belief that I have is if you're good at what you do and you're able to craft a story for why you're good, you will go places. And I think there are enough brand name companies in India today, like you have all the way from Valley companies like Rippling, Stripe, and all of these in India to really big names like Zomato, Swiggy, Flipkart, and all of these Indian startups that people can move from and say, like, I worked here, this is what I built, and you can show that proof of work and easily get a foot in the door.
So let's now deep dive into the immigration landscape. What's what's the what's the Europe opportunity when it comes to immigration? Sell it to me.
I think it's insane, right? Like I said, people really, I was surprised to know how easy and how simple it was to migrate from India to Europe, which is historically perceived to be anti immigration. For me, during COVID, contract signing to landing in Europe with a blue card was 8 weeks.
Can you talk about what the blue
Like,
card is?
yeah. So the blue card is a special kind of visa that European Union gives highly skilled immigrants. So you have to have a salary higher than a certain threshold, which anyone in tech, and I presume we are talking about tech audiences, will very easily cross. And so like you become eligible for a immigration card that is family applicable in the sense you can move your entire family with this. Now, especially Germany has passed a law that says you can even bring your parents and in-laws on this card as dependents, and that allows your spouse to work on your visa, and it puts you on a fast track to permanent residence. In Germany, it's 33 months with a A1 level German, which is like really basic. You speak a few words kind of German. And if you have a B1 level, which is like advanced German, you can get a permanent residence in 21 months, which is insane.
That's
In less than
insane.
2 years, you can become a yeah, you can become a permanent resident of a country like Germany. The beautiful thing is, it also puts you on a fast track to citizenship. If you're on a blue card and if you've been here for 5 years, paying social security and all of that kind of stuff, you're eligible for citizenship. And this is super insane when you compare it to, say, the quagmire that is the American immigration system, or the length of stay required for you to become for you get what do they call it, ILR in the UK. So I think like the EU blue card is something that I think Europe needs to figure out how to sell better, and I think that's been like incredibly good for us.
And so once you get the blue card, you can live in any European country, any.
Technically, you get the thing for a country, which is like the Germany has given me this blue card, but it does give me the right to relocate to anywhere within EU. But what I do lose by doing that is the social security and like the path to permanent residence that I have like accrued in Germany, because that only is around like how much social security contributions have paid to Germany.
And so if you have the EU blue card and you move to another country, then what do you get? How long can you be in that country? Forever? Or
You till your blue card is valid. Like you just need to change the blue card and like the title, like the country of issue and all of that. Like there's some bureaucratic things that are associated with this. But I know many people who have moved from, say, Amsterdam to Berlin or Berlin to Amsterdam, like with just like a very small paperwork. And this gives you like intra-EU mobility like nothing else.
very cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm surprised by enough. I don't know. Is this well known outside Europe? Like, why haven't the whole of Bangalore landed up in Berlin? Like I feel like there's more people that know about London, probably because there's a larger Indian diaspora here. But like, why isn't every coffee shop in Bangalore just talking about this? Like,
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of reasons. One is
or is
that
it like people
typically.
know and they choose not to apply, or is it like they just don't
Yeah,
know?
I don't think people know enough. Enough people know, at least, number one. Number two, I do think that comparing Indian tech salaries and like what the growth opportunities of the Indian tech ecosystem is, when people look at Europe, they feel like it's somehow inferior, like in some senses. So the people who make the decision to move to Europe, like I said, ultimately make that decision based on personal parameters and not purely from a professional parameter. Like if you're someone who just wants to hustle, Europe is probably not the place for you. So, and for these people, even for these people, they're often put off by certain myths like, hey, Europe has like crazy high taxes. They're going to tax you to death. Partly true, but if you look at it relative to the benefits that you get, probably not true anymore. Two is everything sucks in Europe. Everything is like dated. Again, partly true, but there's a perspective. I won't get like maids and like 10-minute groceries and all of this kind of stuff. Depends on the city you live in. But again, like you do end up getting used to not having maids and all of this kind of stuff, because this becomes a lifestyle choice that you end up making. So there are many people who just don't think through a move to Europe in the right lens, in my view. And that's one of the reasons why this doesn't end up being popular. So when you have like a tinted glass view, you don't like take that step forward to figure out what the immigration scene looks like, which actually is like pretty rosy.
You mentioned something that I picked up on that I'd love to go deeper into, which is growth. How does one think about career growth in the German ecosystem?
I think it really depends on the company and the stage of the company that you end up in. I know people who have, say, come to Zalando, grown within the org from, say, like regular IC levels to like head of, director of levels. Same thing is true for Delivery Hero. I know people who have come in at associate director levels and then moved to VP levels. There's like an entire spectrum of opportunities within each organization that you can get. But ultimately, it's going to depend on the companies, depend on the role that you end up taking. I, for one, have been very fortunate to have landed at Wolt, which has been like very, very conducive for my growth professionally, as well as be in Berlin, which has been great for me personally. So I think I got very lucky, but I do think like with the right level of company investigations and like what kind of company you end up applying to. Like, for example, Stripe has an office in Berlin. Nobody is ever going to say Stripe doesn't offer growth. Like, you can apply to Stripe, you can move to Berlin, and you can have like top dollar pay and also crazy good growth. But it's going to come at a cost. Like my work perhaps is more intense than, say, someone at some other company, which offers slightly slower growth. I think it's a tricky balance, but ultimately you do have companies that promise great growth, if you choose the right ones.
So, on that point, I've heard something. Tell me what's the right way to interpret it, right? So, what I've heard is that if you're an immigrant and you're in Germany, and I don't know if this applies to all European Union countries other than UK, but say you've joined at a mid level, you've done pretty well, now you've reached a certain ceiling, which is moment you become a senior director and you're trying to become a VP, SVP, a CXO suite, it starts getting a little harder relative to that mid career growth. There might be cultural nuances here where, typically when we move to a country, we're like, hey, we want to integrate into the culture, but is it that Germany expects you to become a German by the time you're a CXO? Is there some truth to that?
I think there may be some truth to that, but I do know of senior directors and VPs who are Indians. I know someone who is a CPTO at a German founded startup, which is now at a Series A, Series B level. I know people who are at VP level positions at like really established industry focused companies, but on their technology side. I think there is a it may be true. I'm not 100% sure, but I can think of anecdotal examples where there are counterfactuals to this.
Yeah, my sense is that it might be relatively easier in engineering and product versus something which might be more
Yes,
go to market or stuff like that.
yes.
Like
I
becoming
think
the
that is
CMO,
definitely true.
becoming the CMO of a German company might be probably much harder than becoming the CPO or a CTO or something like that.
Absolutely. And I think like if you compare it relative to say UK or US, which are like more migrant heavy and migrant built, I think maybe it's more difficult in Europe for sure, continental Europe for sure.
Got it. What about starting up? I know that there's a lot of founders of Indian origin in Europe who are starting up. How easy is it to start up? I know from a investing perspective, it's a pain to invest in German companies. If you're not in Germany, there's a lot of paperwork, literally paperwork involved. But just in terms of starting up, like what have you noticed?
I've seen that it's actually painful, to be honest, because one, the paperwork is real. I know a couple of friends who have started up or work in like really early stage startups, and the thing that they complain about the most is the paperwork. And also, taxation is not, again, early in your startup life, you're going to give a lot of equity, and ESOPs are not friendly from a tax perspective. Here, I think they actually have something like phantom RSUs and stuff like that. There's some funny term that people use for awarding you stocks purely to get around this taxation issue, which is actually one of the things that are highlighted in the Draghi report, like make liquidity simpler and like make
Yeah.
taxations like more standardized across EU and stuff like that. So I think today it is pretty onerous. And like if you ask me like if you were to start up, would you consider starting up in Germany? My answer would probably be no, because of the level of bureaucracy and like level of compliance requirements that are just involved.
Yeah, I see two kinds. I see people who do start in Germany, but I also see people who, when they decide to start up, are considering a move to the UK or set it up as a US
Yes.
company, and then different ways around that. But just around starting up, like, do you see it as a conducive environment, like beyond the paperwork and the compliance, just the culture of starting up? Is that something that your I don't know, like in from Wolt, have people quit to start up companies in the last few years?
Yes,
Because I
they
know I
have.
know
They've
there
also
there are a
raised.
lot of people doing that at Zalando for sure.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I think Zalando has had this like culture of like more people quitting. And I think Volt is another company where you will probably see this. I know people who have quit Volt, started a company, raised money, like double-digit $1 million, like that kind of money. And yeah, but I think this is more the exception than the norm, simply because I think the culture is good. There are a lot of people who try to do good work, but ultimately there is that early stage startup grind mindset that is like not super common. I'm not saying it doesn't exist, it's just that it's not super common.
got it. Okay. And just the political climate, how's it been in Germany?
I think it's taking an interesting shift right now. I think two sides. On Germany, and I think many European countries, a lot of politicians realize that immigration is probably a way to get more talent in, and they realize that technology is gonna and this is something that you would see with Germany's immigrant friendly law changes. Like earlier, it used to be 8 years to get a citizenship. Now it's 5 years. They made it easier to get a blue card. A very interesting difference so that the German government passed last year was that if you qualify for a EU blue card, for example, a consular mission earlier could say like, I'm not going to grant this for whatever reason. They had the discretionary power. But in a recent law change, if I understood it correctly, they have said that you become entitled to a blue card if you pass the checks. Like, so it's no longer a discretionary power, it's an entitlement. So these kinds of nuances are changing, citizenship becoming easier and all of this kind of stuff. And Germany very recently was even considering similar to a 30% tax ruling here for highly skilled immigrants. This is one side of the spectrum. And like if people do end up adopting things from the Draghi report and whatnot, we will see an acceleration of this. On the other front, I do think that whatever we see in London, for example, the anti-migrant riots, and what we have, say, in France, which is like a pretty strong anti-immigrant, anti-refugee sentiment, also growing in the Netherlands, is will also come to Germany because economics 101 tells you that when you have technology displacing jobs, this is usually the low skilled, low paid jobs. But this is also combined with highly skilled migration and all of that. And a lot of the anger is channeled towards the migrants. And we see this in the recent election in East Germany, where for the first time since World War II, an extreme uh, right wing party won elections. This is a neo Nazi party that won elections for the first time since World War II in East Germany. So I think we will see more and more of this coming up across Western world. But the other part, which is that countries are going to soon realize that migration is a necessary thing and they have to open their borders for highly skilled laborers. That is also something that people will realize, which Germany is realizing.
Which is interesting because I do feel that governments in general are becoming more polarized. On one side, you see a lot of rise of nationalism, right wing, maybe even the political spectrum. The definition is changing. What was center now is becoming something else. Like it's just like super moving fairly quickly. But at the same time, I also feel that it's going to become like there's going to be sort of certain safe havens, right? So like a place like Berlin, which benefits a lot from international talent, people are going to come and sort of aggregate over there until there is another such hub in different parts of Germany, and then those areas will probably start to see growth and probably more immigrants coming in there. Well, because like one of the things that I was going through in the Draghi report is also and this is something that we discussed in the previous podcast that I had with Karthik, who was the co-founder of Prop Tiger, which is that I think the nature of technology and the nature of free markets is that they're going to grow regardless of whether your policies allow it or not, because you always have offshoring. So one of the threats that Europe might have if they don't open their doors to talent, because I feel like upskilling talent is a medium to long term game. You can't just have like 10,000 engineers tomorrow if you wanted, is that places like Middle East or places like India, even Nigeria now, they'll just rise up and say that, hey, you know what, just set up an offshore entity and we'll take care of the talent, right? Like if push comes to shove, there's no reason why all the European countries are not going to have I mean, historically, if you look at Rocket had two big internet and engineering centers, right? One was in Russia and one was in Vietnam. So it's not something which is not common. Deliveroo has what I think a 500 member engineering team in India already. Leo recently launched their Chennai centers. So I think those are the things to sort of deal with, right? And Europe should have an opinion on this, or at least be aware.
Absolutely. And I think, I don't know if you saw this report from last week, which said the Volkswagen Group is considering closing some of its factories in Germany because a lot of the jobs have moved to India. and Germany has become like very expensive. And one of the labor union agreements of no job cuts till 2029, the clock is ticking on that. So like I think modernization of the workforce, relaxing some of the labor laws, making sure that there is a free market spin to the socialist undercurrent that usually exists in Europe. I think that's what the Draghi report also points out. Like, please wake up. In order for you to save your social safety net, someone has to pay the bills, and that's not happening right now. And I think that's something that I think like what was super clear in the 2022 wave of layoffs was that there actually used to be more jobs from say Uber, Google, Microsoft, and all of these places. Like I used to see more openings on LinkedIn, and I see fewer later because I feel like, and Bloomberg also wrote a piece on this, that these guys realized how hard it is to lay someone off in Europe. And the cost of having very strong labor laws is that companies will just refuse to hire. So I think that's a very big risk that policymakers are taking right now.
Yeah, I wasn't aware about that so much in Germany as much as I am in France. France, it's incredible. Like you have to give like
France, for
60%.
example, yeah.
Yeah. But I think companies the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, where if companies are like, hey, what we need this talent and we have to somewhere come in between, and
Yes.
that's probably how some of these decisions end up being taken. At the extreme higher end, I think it doesn't really matter for talent. Like if you're the top whatever, right, 5% in something, like location is less of an issue because just the volume is so much lower. But I think it's that big middle ground, right? Like you want to hire like engineers with 5 years of experience, or like your you know data scientists who are just like 2 years into the job, like which is like bulk of the bread and butter. I think that's where a lot of these things start playing roles.
I think for these people, though, I wouldn't recommend moving to Europe or moving to, like, say, some place where you have not like built a proof of work, a portfolio of things that you can say, like, this is my work. I'm happy to like show you what I've done. Show, don't tell. I think unless you build that repository of stuff, maybe moving out is not the answer. I don't know how this fares in say London. If you recommend these people to move to London, for example, but I think that's definitely true for Europe. This is my personal perspective.
Interesting. Yeah, I think, I mean, I feel like I would look at it in two ways. I think if you're young, it doesn't really matter because, you're not tied to a place. You
Yeah.
look at things very opportunistically. You don't even know the culture. You're trying to taste the culture, see if it works for you. So if you're in your 20s, I would say just go, take some risks, and there's enough time to figure out. What helps is the fact that you could, in a period of 5-6 years, actually try out 2-3 different countries. If it doesn't work out, and you still know permanent residency is an option, and if nothing works out, you can still go to India and do incredibly well. I think once you have a family, some of these things start becoming important, where you have to think about kids, you have to think about long term. You have a big enough asset base where you might start thinking about taxation and stuff like that, or things like industry and stuff like that. I do think UK is extremely attractive because of just we like to joke, right? It's our motherland, because of the colonial past, and the fact that it's more English speaking. And I think it's a little bit more similar to the US in the sense that I think UK feels that as long as you're coming and paying our taxes, we don't really care. I think EU on the other hand is like, hey, we are welcoming of you as long as you integrate into our culture and become a
And
bit
you bring
more,
something to the table.
and you bring something. I think UK is, at least in the professional world, pretty much like bring something to the table. I'm not contesting that, but I do think that this whole thing of something as simple as like English being a language of business, I don't think that's the case in Europe. That's the reason companies are not able
Yeah.
to just expand to 5 countries, right? Beyond the major hubs. And so I think from that perspective, one could build a case that UK is good. But I think if you're young, I wouldn't worry about it. You should just go wherever you're finding an interesting experience and get a different perspective on life. Also, I think just
For
the
me,
way you
at least
work
in
with people,
EU,
right? There's a certain way of working in India which which you and I
it's not
know.
going to work well in Europe. That much I can tell you. That much I can tell you. I think Europe has a very different culture, different way of working. There's this book that my head of engineering keeps telling I should read called The Culture Map. I'm yet to read it, but apparently it talks about these differences in detail. On the point about experience versus young, I think specifically in the EU, at least my experience has been that the more senior you are, the more doors will open for you purely from like number of years of experience. People can ding your application, especially if you're moving from say like India and all of that. And there are many companies that have a standing policy that says we won't relocate people below this level, and that level is usually like fairly senior.
Got it. So then what is, you remember like a couple of years ago, the German chancellor said that we need 40,000 people in IT from India or something like that. Like these were all senior roles?
Yeah, I think it depends on what kind of companies we are talking about. There are still a lot of IT employees who move for Accenture, Wipro and the likes, like basically the witch companies. And there are a lot of people who come on site who do technology for the industrial Germany, like Volkswagen, Deutsche Bank. Bosch, these guys have like really big technology functions and they need a lot of IT people, the IT people for that. Then there is a startup like the high tech Meta fans of the world that I think is a different ball game altogether. I think these are the companies that you actually want to be in, at least the people who are looking at this podcast. They
Yeah.
want to be in these companies. And I think for these folks, it's best to think about EU when you're like relatively senior.
Awesome. Awesome. Great, man. Thank you so much, Gokul. I think we're just out of time. A wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and all the best in your journey.
Thank you so much, Rishabh. Have a good one.